Welcome to week 7 in healthcare managerial accounting. So this week we're going to turn our attention to the issue of pricing. So the first part of the lecture discussion deals with the generic issue of pricing, and we'll look at pricing in most industries, and that certainly is not the case in healthcare to classify them as being in most industries. But before we get into the particular issues in healthcare, I want to talk about pricing in general. And then there's a particular topic called target pricing, which I'd like you to take a look at. So what you'll find in the week 7 lecture materials is a PowerPoint that talks about pricing strategies, and then a PowerPoint that talks about target costing and target pricing. So I'm going to go through those slides very briefly. You'll have to look at them in a little more depth. And then when we're done looking at that, I've posted some items around healthcare pricing. And the biggest issue with healthcare pricing is the lack of transparency. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's first talk about some generic issues related to pricing. So I'm going to share a new window with you. And the window is going to be the PowerPoint slides that I've created for you. Dealing with generic pricing issues. So one of the things that we talk about pricing, we should keep in mind is that strategically, firms in every industry, including healthcare, find themselves in one of two boxes, strategic boxes. And this idea was really created by Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School. So those of you who have looked at strategic planning and are taking a course on strategic analysis may be familiar with Michael Porter, but he's often considered the guru of strategic planning. And his thinking says that basically a firm or a product or service finds itself either being one that is differentiated or one that is a cost leader. And in his view, we have to understand where we sit along the spectrum, and we need to focus our energy accordingly. So we may find our product or service is either one that's differentiated or one that has to be cost focused and a cost leader. And that can also be true of a particular firm. So we may find in healthcare, for example, that we have a specialized area where we can differentiate ourselves. And if that's the case, then we typically have some leverage over pricing. When we're in a cost leadership or a highly competitive market where we don't differentiate our product or service, then typically we don't have much control over pricing, and the pricing is set by the free market. So this is often called being a price taker. So in highly competitive, economists call this perfectly competitive marketplaces, where we're more offering a Me Too type of product or service, then the market sets the price. And the survivors in that market have to be very particular about managing cost, understanding cost, and managing cost. Where if I'm a monopoly or I have something that's significantly unique about a product or service that people want to buy or are willing to consume, then I have some level of flexibility with my pricing, and managing cost may not be quite as important as when I'm in a highly competitive marketplace. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we talk about pricing, that where we sit in the strategic spectrum is an important issue. So this is really taken from Porter's work on this whole issue about are we cost leaders or do we differentiate ourselves? And so that's an important consideration even when we're in the healthcare market to think about. So cost leadership strategies basically talk about no frills, right? We have a standardized product, commodity-like product, and we essentially have to understand our cost structure, drive our cost structure, and ultimately, the only ones surviving in a highly competitive marketplace are the cost leaders. So you think about the Walmarts, the Costcos, the Southwest Airlines, and the like, right down the line. These are the low-cost providers where people really aren't differentiating one product from another, but we're looking for the lowest price. Okay, so You can read through the rest of these slides, but basically, when we talk about cost leadership strategies, Porter prescribes different things that that we have to factor into our thinking. One is that we basically are looking for taking advantage of every opportunity we can find in the supply chain, right? So we want to develop relationships with suppliers where we can enable them to deliver their product to our service to us in an efficient manner. And we want to recognize the other efficiencies and non-value added things have to be weeded out of the system from the beginning point, which is our suppliers, all the way through making our customers able to acquire our product or service in the most efficient manner. So getting rid of any non-value added activity along the way. So Dell Computer is a master of the supply chain, low cost provider, and a commodity business, PCs and the like. And so they basically have eliminated the middleman, right? They don't go through the typical channels of retail or distribution. They sell directly to their customers. So they've eliminated that process. So and so through technology, that is able to occur in many more industries. So when we differentiate, then we have something unique or something special about our product or service. And that typically allows us to sell things that people are willing to pay a premium for. And so cost becomes less important in that particular market. Okay, so again, you can read through these slides. At the end of the day, it's just important to recognize that we typically have to figure out where are we? Are we in the cost leadership mode, or are we in the product differentiation mode? And that can be also, service, of course. Okay, so so this discussion here about what might create cost leadership or give us the advantages in the cost leadership perspective. So economy of scale, basically is if I can build up a large enough scale, then I can drive my fixed cost per unit down below anyone else's. Might be that I have more experience, sometimes called learning curves. Could be that I'm able to be the first into the market and come up with some natural protections in the marketplace. Or it could be technology, and so forth. Okay, so so if at the end of the day, what I'm really trying to do is to create a cost structure and an efficiency that creates a barrier to entry, right? Or weeds out others who can't be quite as efficient or as effective as I am in producing the product or service. Okay, and that will allow me to be one of the last people or firms standing in a particular industry. Okay, so and in a competitive market, we're looking for strong management controls, formal budgeting policies, very tight credit controls, tight spending policies, travel, that we're looking for bargain travel as opposed to, being concerned about, first class travel and luxury hotels and the like. And this all permeates through our culture and our attitudes and our leadership styles, and so forth. Okay, so all right, so you can read through much of this. So when we are in a competitive market, really the market sets the price. So we have to operate under that market set price. But when we have some product differentiation, then we can start to talk about different types of pricing approaches. So it could be that we're going to go for market share. If we're going for market share, then we typically are going to have what's called penetration pricing, which is that we're going to lower our price so as to either take business away from our competitors or drive our competitors out of business or discourage others from getting into the business. Or we could go for an issue of value pricing, where we are going to get into the discussion about looking at what value we provide to a particular consumer and pricing our product or service along that spectrum. Recently there was a cure found for Hep C by a pharmaceutical company. And there was a lot of debate about the high price of that product that they put their cure for Hep C on the market at. And their discussion was really around the value to the consumer. They said, while it's cost $80,000 for the cure, if you look at the value to the consumer, it's much more than that, right? This person goes from being sick, having to go to the hospital on a regular basis, or having some alternative treatments, all of which is very costly, can be debilitating, to something where over a 12-week period, this person can be cured, and thus they save all this other expense in the healthcare system. They're able to lead a much more robust life, and so forth and so on. So that's an example of value-based pricing. So there's a lot of other issues here around pricing that come into play, and you should read through what I've posted here. But basically, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that when we talk about pricing, we can go after market share, or we can go after profit maximization. So we could talk about market skimming, which is I'm going to introduce something at a very high price level. Apple sometimes will do this if they're able to introduce a product like iPhone 6 or iPhone 7 early in the system, in the process. They may have a higher price, and then because they have a pent-up demand for that, and then they'll drop their prices over time. And with market skimming, what we're really trying to do is maximize our profitability. Okay, value pricing I've talked about. Sometimes we'll take the strategy of loss leader. Loss leader says, I'm going to offer something at a loss or a break-even point to try to attract you into my business. Okay, and the reason I would do that is because once you're in my business, then you're going to buy other things. So sometimes I'll put something on sale, and I know that will drive you into my storefront or my website. But while you're there, typically you're going to buy other products or services. So supermarkets often do this, as do other retailers. And then psychological pricing deals with pricing around different price. Often it's a number, right, or a certain price level that people won't pay more than a certain price for a particular product or service. Now, sometimes you see this in real estate, right? You go to sell your house, and real estate brokers who have a lot of experience know that consumers often have a budget that they can afford to pay. So they may say, if you want to reach a certain market, then you have to price your house at a certain level. And if you price it above that, then it's going to limit the number of consumers who are looking for it. Well, other businesses have known this for many years, and use psychological pricing as a basis too. Okay, so all right. So the other stuff you can read through. So with price discrimination, what we're really talking about is being selective about pricing. We're not talking about discriminating against people, but we're talking about how do we understand the market, the segments, and then price accordingly. Okay, predatory pricing we've talked about, and then when we talk about other types of pricing, particularly when we talk about cost-based pricing, what do we mean by cost? Right? Do we use full absorption costing? Do we use variable costing, or do we use some other cost as a basis? Because oftentimes a firm will find itself in a position, particularly if they're able to differentiate themselves, where they'll use some sort of cost as a basis. So in the simplest discussion of this, a company like Costco, a giant retailer, they use cost as a basis for pricing. They mark everything they have up at a 12% above cost. And they know their cost easily because they don't make anything. They buy everything from their suppliers, and they add 12% to it. And if you're a manufacturer, however, or if you're a big service provider, as many healthcare providers are, and you're using cost as a basis, then you have to figure out, what cost am I talking about? Am I talking about my direct material and direct labor, or am I talking about my full absorption cost, which includes overhead? And then what costs are included in that equation? So. Okay, so So marginal cost pricing basically says I'm going to look at my cost that change as a result of my particular decision. Okay, so rather than taking full absorption, I look at the incremental cost that change. Okay, contribution pricing, you can read through this. And then target pricing. So let me change the discussion out to target pricing. So target pricing and target costing is an interesting concept that's been around now for 15 or 20 years, really originated in Japan. And the idea with target pricing is that I'm looking at setting my price and I'm setting a target cost over a longer period of time. So the traditional model in the United States, when we talk about pricing, is to talk about price from the perspective of a particular product or service in the short term. And when we do that, what we talk about is that I'm going to do it either based on what the market sets or what my costs are based on what it costs me to make that product or service. All of which seems to make perfect sense in the short term. But with target pricing, what we say is that over the long term, I know that smartphones, a particular automobile, a laptop, a handheld device, and so forth and so on, I know that the sweet spot is at a particular price level. So let's take smartphones as an example. I know that over the long term, that most people are going to be willing to pay $200 to $300 for a smartphone. Okay, if I were to price my smartphone at $1,000 or $2,000, and I would offer a lot more functionality, then I might find some customers who are willing to pay that price, right? And depending on the functionality. So let's say that I make it indestructible, right? So I may find that the military, for example, may find that an indestructible phone, they're willing to pay the $1,000 for it. But the average consumer, you're going to say, you know what, I can live without that functionality. So the sweet spot for many products and services, we know where that's going to be over the long term. And so what that generates is the idea that I have to have a target cost to go along with the target price. So if I know the sweet spot for a smartphone, for example, for the majority of people is, I'll just throw a number out, is $300, okay? And I know that I want to make a certain margin on that product. And let's say for the sake of discussion, I want to make a 40% margin on that particular phone. Then I know that my cost has to operate at only 60% of that. So what that says is that when I design a particular product or service, in this particular case, a smartphone, I know that it can't cost me more than $120 to make that phone. So what that says is that I can only have certain functionality in that phone. So when I design that particular product, then I know that I have to tell my design people that you have to limit your design functionality so that it doesn't cost more than $120 to make, because we need to make a profit and so forth. And so the same could be applied in a healthcare situation, that in that particular situation, what we could do is we could say that we want to perform a certain function, whether it be a certain medical procedure, might be a simple medical procedure, like doing a blood test, or maybe a more complex medical procedure, like doing an operation. But if we were in a competitive market, what we would say is that we have a constraint, and that constraint is that consumers are only willing to pay a certain price for that particular product or service. And so as a result, we'd have to design our service to be at a certain level of functionality. So that's the idea here. Okay, so the rest of this you can read through. So what I want to do now is to move on to the other discussion. The other discussion really deals with the issue of healthcare pricing, transparency, and related issues. So with healthcare price, when we talk about healthcare pricing, one of the big issues that we've had is a lack of transparency with pricing. Okay, so the question is, what are people paying for healthcare? So if we were to be honest with ourselves, you would ask yourself, do you know what you pay to see your primary care physician, or do you know what it costs, or what it costs for a particular procedure, let's say an emergency room visit or some kind of operation? Most of us would say, probably not. Or if we do, we know after the fact, after we've already consumed the particular product or service. So when I make an appointment with my primary care physician, unlike other products or services I consume, I don't ask, by the way, how much is that going to be, right? Because when I drop my car off for service, right, I always ask my mechanic, can you call me first to let me know how much that's going to be before you perform the service, right? And so the same is true for most other products or services that we consume as individuals. But when it comes to healthcare, we don't ask that question. And if we did ask that question, the answer often would be that there is not an answer, right? That prices aren't posted. We don't know the cost of that particular service that we're getting. And so that is often an issue. So there's a lot of discussion in this whole area around, and it's called pricing transparency, right? So the things I've posted here really helps us to kind of frame the problem that a lack of transparency has created, and then offer some ideas on how we might move towards more transparency. And part of that is to understand the cost of the service in a consistent and equitable way. So that's the second topic, or the special topic around pricing, right? So the first discussion we have for week 7 is understanding general discussions around pricing that every industry faces, including target costing and target pricing. And then we delve into the issue around the special issues in healthcare. And the lack of transparency is the biggest thing when we talk about healthcare pricing. Okay, so in addition to that, I did post a discussion board question this week. So if you go to course tools and you go to discussion board, which you'll see, and you click on this link, you'll see under week 7, there's a discussion board question. And so let me just elaborate on what that question is. It basically says there has been much criticism about the lack of transparency in healthcare pricing. Some experts believe this has been one reason why healthcare costs have consistently increased for so many years. And so then I throw out some examples. Do you know the cost of your primary care physician, or the price, or to a local emergency room visit? And if you do, you're in the very small minority of people who would even think about that. And then I ask, can you ask another product or service that you'd consume without knowing a price? So, one of the things that comes up when I bring my dog to the vet is I always ask. Many consumers don't ask, how much is the service going to be? And so can what should be done about healthcare pricing transparency by consumers, by firms, and by government? And why have healthcare organizations and the insurance industry not been a big advocate for more transparency? Okay, so those are the things I'd like you to discuss after you've looked at the postings and the videos. Okay, so as always, please call me, email me with any questions you might have. Okay, thank you very much.